Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Progressive American. I'm sitting here with Clay Risen, a reporter and editor at the New York Times, the author of The Crowded Hour, a New York Times notable book of 2019, and a finalist for the Gilder Lehrman Prize in Military History. He also writes about whiskey. However, today we will be discussing his new book, Red Scare, Blacklists, McCarthyism, and the Making of Modern America. Thank you for joining me, Mr. Risen.
Oh, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. So I think right off the bat, I wanted to start off with talk about not only how you came to focus on the Red Scare, but what it means for the American people in general today. I know you mentioned a lot of Americans aren't particularly familiar with it. In fact, they're not aware most of the time that there were actually two Red Scares. But in particular, what made you want to focus on the Red Scare, and why is it so relevant today?
Yeah, I think part of it was exactly that there are these things from the Red Scare that we remember, Joe McCarthy, the Rosenberg trial, the Hollywood 10, and the blacklist in the entertainment industry. But I think for a lot of people, those things exist separately. And so I wanted to tell a story that really brought them all together because they really did exist in the same narrative thread. They were all linked together, starting in about 1946, going through for well over another decade. It was this period of intense anti-communist hysteria in the United States. And while there was a lot of reason to be concerned about Soviet espionage and subversion, it was not just blown out of proportion, but really weaponized by people who had other agendas to go after their political enemies. And it spread far beyond the issues of national security, say at the State Department or in our atomic weapons sector, to include everything from teachers to Hollywood actors to any postal workers, any sort of corner of America, regardless of whether it mattered what their beliefs were. The Red Scare affected them, and so I wanted to tell that story. And I was always really interested in the history. It's sort of coincidental in both good for me in that you always want buzz around your book, but bad maybe for the country, and that a lot of these stories now feel like current events. Every day, some new story pops up that has a direct reference back to some episode in the Red Scare. It's quite chilling.
And to kind of hit off of that, it is concerning for a variety of reasons. Not least of all, the role of trauma. I know you've made a point that unfortunately a lot of the histories of the Red Scare kind of downplay the role of trauma from World War II, and how a lot of people just fundamentally still hadn't fully recovered from such a horrible war. And I was wondering, what role did World War II play in contributing to the Red Scare? How did it exacerbate really the security state and its abuses, and really just create the environment for this hysteria?
It's a great question. There are really two ways I'd say. The first is that to the extent that the Red Scare was a cultural conflict coming out of the 1930s between New Deal progressives and the backlash to the New Deal and anti-New Deal uh, conservatives, the war really put kind of a damper on any sort of real conflict. So it was only after the war that you saw this conservative backlash really take up the issue of communism in this new context of the Cold War, where it was no longer just this conspiracy theory that communists were in control of the government, or it still was a conspiracy theory, but you couldn't dismiss it as easily. And so people who claimed that communists were living under our bed sheets and in our closets and in the State Department suddenly were taken very seriously. But the other way the war was relevant or shaped this era is exactly as you said, that there was a lot of trauma coming out of World War II. We remember the post-war era as this period of abundance and good feelings, and eventually it was that. But in those first few years, it was marked by a real sense of insecurity and a sense of fear and a sense of trauma. There were millions of service members coming back or not coming back from the war. Those who did had psychological wounds, physical wounds that were often is sort of ignored by the public, which had its own trauma of going through a period of rationing and sort of states of emergency. There was also a fear that the Great Depression would return, and And so and then in the context of all of that, the Cold War sets in, and within a matter of months after the end of the war, people are being told, "Oh, actually, now we have a new war, a Cold War that could be a hot war, and this time with nuclear weapons." And so everyone needs to be ready for that. And so not only were people sort of already fearful and insecure about their place in the world, their country's place in the world, but they were also prepared for these claims about national security. The way that we talked about it during World War II is to a large extent set the template and set the grounds for the way we talked about it during the Red Scare.
Yeah, and I've always kind of wondered about that because, admittedly, you're right. I think that a lot of the histories don't do enough justice about how traumatic World War II was. Not only because we have a triumphalist like view of history that sees us progressing ever onward, but we also are under this false impression that we can never fall into hysteria or authoritarian thinking. But to kind of focus on this trauma element and really kind of transition to HUAC, I know in previous interviews you've mentioned that HUAC was not initially created to hunt communism, but was instead initially started as a means to root out Nazi espionage. And I'm curious, how did that transition go from hunting the most extreme of the far right to really chasing boogeymen and communists that were under the bed sheets, as you called them?
Yeah, a lot of it has to do with just the capture of the committee by people who fundamentally wanted to use it as a tool to go after the administration. It was created ostensibly to go after any kind of un-American activities. That was its charge. But you're absolutely right that early on, the target was Nazi sympathizers and the far right. But because it had a pretty broad mandate, as soon as the chairmanship switched to a conservative Texas Democrat named Martin Dies, who had started off as a pro Roosevelt, pro New Deal congressman and then turned rabidly against it. As soon as he got control, the whole focus of the committee switched, and he started going after the administration, and he went after labor unions, and he even tried to go after Hollywood. And a lot of it was dismissed, by the public, by even other members of Congress. It was seen as this sideshow. He was seen as sort of a joke and as just an attention grabber. But it did help set the stage for later, much more effective witch hunts, simply by putting out the idea that Congress had the right to do this sort of thing.
Yeah, and by setting a precedent for hunting people because of their believed political affiliations, you can set the standard for future yeah, can't speak today, inquisition, so to speak. But to that point, when I was going through your book, you mentioned explicitly that many of the members of HUAC were avowed white supremacists and segregationists, and that kind of does lead me to the question of how the New Deal coalition was starting to fall apart a little bit early on, partially because of racial issues. A lot of people were perfectly willing, as you mentioned, to support the New Deal when they thought white people were benefiting, but when black people and other minority groups were, seems that faded away. How did that kind of manifest, and how quickly really did that play a role, or was that there from the very beginning?
Well, it came out of the 1930s, this tension in the Democratic coalition between the emerging urban Northern Democrats who were more liberal, more multiracial, more directly in favor of big government to help out the little guy. And what had long been really the dominant sort of the cornerstone of the party, the Southern Democrats. And some of them were populist, some of them were in favor of big government, liked big government projects. And there's no coincidence that things like the Tennessee Valley Authority and rural electrification and highways directly benefited the South. But they were very wary of the power of this new expanded government to uh, tilt against segregation. And they were very wary of guys like Franklin Roosevelt, who was very clearly pushing the party away from segregation, away from the power of the Southern Democrats. And so HUAC became a tool in that sort of conflict. And you're right that early on, especially, many of the members were avowed white supremacists. John Rankin being the most obvious example. He was one of the most powerful members of Congress, and also not just a white supremacist, but a nasty anti-Semite. And now, as when HUAC was kind of this sort of fringe committee in Congress, no one really paid much attention to who was on it. Once the Red Scare happened and it started to move toward the center of congressional politics, a lot of those fringe congressmen or guys like Rankin were pushed aside because suddenly HUAC was a hot seat. It's where you wanted to be if you were a congressman on the make. And so guys like Richard Nixon came in, who, was himself not averse to red baiting, but was much more polished, was not a racial bigot, at least didn't promote that as his part of his worldview in Congress. And so the profile of the committee rose, and I'd say, standard of its members rose as well.
So, and it became more legitimate by removing the most extreme members, and the most overt who were saying the quiet parts out loud. It could basically give itself this air of legitimacy. But
Yeah,
that
that's
oh,
right.
sorry.
No, that's absolutely right.
And just to kind of play into that a little bit more, because you mentioned anti-Semitism, and when it comes to the way Helen Bryan was treated by the FBI, you mentioned that they basically tacked on this idea that she was Jewish, uh, as a way to sort of portray her as inherently dangerous. What role did anti-Semitism play, not just in the FBI's uh, examination of Helen Bryan, but also in just how they handled the Red Scare in general, since a lot of these conspiracy theories of infiltration have a lot of anti-Semitic underlying
Sure.
themes.
Yeah, so anti-Semitism certainly runs through both the conflicts of the 1930s and through the story of the Red Scare. It's not always present, but it often is. I mean, you look at the Rosenberg case, and while anti-Semitism didn't drive every aspect of the case, and I do think it's pretty clear that they were guilty of espionage, the rush to execute them and the public support betrayed a thick context or thick attitude of anti-Semitism on the part of, these people who would turn out in at watch parties. This is on when they were executed, and shout just really, outwardly, just some of the worst anti-Semitic comments, that you can think of. And it really betrayed kind of one of the motivations underneath this. The idea was that communism was often thought of as a Jewish plot, or
Mhm.
that Jews were the rank and file of the Communist Party. And it's, look, I mean, it's not incorrect to say that yes, many communists were Jewish, but the idea that it was part of a plot, that there was a communist plot that was intricately tied with what anti-Semites would say was this Jewish plot controlling the United States from the shadows. These things are hard. These were intertwined lines of conspiracy thinking, and that's not unique to the Red Scare. It's not unique to the United States, but it shows up very, very clearly. But it's also complicated because many of the most ardent anti-communists were also Jewish. And many of them, but not all of them, had been members of the party as children, or I mean, as young people, and for a variety of reasons, had turned against the party and
Mhm.
become just as passionately against it as they had been for it. And there's an entire book, which is, I only touch on briefly, but there's an entire book to be done about, so the role that Judaism and Jewish identity played during the Red Scare, because it was both a line, sort of anti-Semitism was a line of attack, but it was also in some ways a motivation for people to get out and become anti-communist activists. To say, "Hey, Jews are not responsible for this." I mean, you found this in many of the most adamant anti-Jewish anti-communists. They wanted to say, "Hey, this we are, we want to prove that Jews are good Americans and not what the anti-Semites say." So it's a very complicated story, but I think it's one that you can't avoid when you talk about the subject.
And I will say anti-Semitism is one of the weirdest prejudices I've had the displeasure of encountering. I'm
Yeah,
not Jewish myself, but there are actually a subsection of people who accuse me of being Jewish, because they think I'm part of some sort of plot. So it is an interesting thing when you brought up Helen Bryan being accused falsely of being Jewish by the FBI. I was like, oh, I've seen that before.
yeah,
But
and
to
there's
cut,
and look, I mean, there's also, as we know, always, whether back then or today, but especially back then, there's also just a casual anti-Semitism, right?
Mhm.
Where people just draw certain assumptions about, and the true with anti-black racism or any kind of prejudice. Sometimes we think it's always explicit and passionate and angry, and it's not always that. Sometimes it's just something that sits in the back of someone's mind and guides their assumptions about other people, uh, and that's dangerous as well. And I think that's what you saw with Helen Bryant. There was just this assumption. Well, you know, she works for civil rights. She, is active in peace projects. She, I don't know, to the person writing the report, kind of looks Jewish. So we're just going to say she's probably Jewish. Why that's even relevant, don't know. But that was a part of it, and it spoke volumes that someone took that as a note.
Yeah, and this is where it's kind of one of those things where you have to balance the understanding of this as just a regular hysteria, but and also the fact that it was also a serious issue of prejudice. One of the things when I was in college, I was looking into was the role of white citizens councils in
Mm,
portraying the civil rights movement as being controlled by Jewish people, because there was this patronizing attitude of only Jewish people could be this intelligent to organize these people. These black
yeah.
people can't advocate for their rights on their own, that kind of nonsense. But to get into that kind of thing and how and to turn to today, I was wondering, to what role do these kinds of themes of anti-black racism, anti-Semitism, and conspiratorial rhetoric appear in modern right-wing circles and even in some left-wing circles as well?
Yeah, I mean, look, I would be the umpteenth person to comment on the complicated role that anti-Semitism plays in modern politics, in a way that I think for people, certainly of my generation, feels a little strange, because I grew up with a real, I think generally in the country, a small p progressive idea about American history, that we were, you know, never a perfect country, but moving forward, leaving behind prejudices. And while those prejudices still exist, they're nothing like the past. So we would look back and say, oh, there was a point in time when Jews weren't allowed into a lot of colleges or into certain, white shoe law firms. But that's not the case anymore. We've moved beyond that. And now to see in the 21st century, those hatreds reemerge. And again, as you say, on both sides, both the right and the left, in ways that are different, but often the same, and always with the same sort of set of assumptions underneath it. The same thing with anti-black racism. It has been, I think it doesn't even take someone of my age to see this. I think anyone who lived through or experienced the George Floyd protests and watched that might have come out of it and said, "Hey, we as a country are really taking a giant step forward in that idea that this is all this march of progress toward a certain end." And now to see in 2025 that a lot of those achievements were temporary, they were maybe not in great faith, they were done not in great faith. You see a lot of companies pulling back on promises that were made in the immediate aftermath of George Floyd's murder, and an attempt to erase a lot of what people on the left have considered achievements, and kind of a consensus of how to talk about these things. And so it's dispiriting to see that, but I think certain realists would look at this and say, well, I'm not surprised at all because this is just the country reverting to its mean. And that's it's hard not to sympathize with that point of view at this point in the 21st century.
And I'll admit I participated in, the George Floyd protests. Got really enthused thinking we were gonna turn the tables, but now I think one of the things I've started to realize, and a lot of the people have started to realize, is that nothing is inevitable. It can always get worse, and in many cases it does, without people actively pushing for it and putting, institutional power behind it. But to, kinda turn towards how that prejudice has been weaponized in today's society, in particular with the Trumpist movement. I know you didn't set out to write a book on Trump, but you do mention that there is a bit of a line between the Red Scare and McCarthy era politics with the rise of modern Trumpism. And what would you say would be like just the top uh, common themes with Trumpist politics and McCarthy era red baiting?
Well, I think certainly you can point to any number of tactics that are very common from the McCarthy era, from McCarthy himself, and today. But I think the real through line is the end of the Red Scare. For a lot of Americans, felt like just a return to normal. That the fear was gone, and that you know, in their minds, the threat had passed. But for a hardcore of Americans, the threat had won, essentially. They felt like McCarthy had been fighting a good fight, but that he had been defeated, sacrificed. He was a martyr. And we're not talking about a small number of people. When McCarthy died, he had something like 25 to 30% support in the United States. And these were people who truly believed that there was uh, not just inefficiency or bad policymaking at the federal level, but an active conspiracy, this cabal of left wing elites, communists, anti-American, whatever, running things, and that was the long term fight, right? That the New Deal, the modern federal government, the liberal state had to be demolished, and so even as sort of centrist, or let's say mainstream conservatism accepted the broad outline of modern politics and in fact participated in it, or modern policymaking, there always was this fringe, and it popped up from time to time. You see it under Goldwater and the Goldwater movement. Years later, Buchanan and the Buchananite populist movement, and I think you see it again today. And not only is it similar, but there are explicit links. Whether you look at intellectual influences or even figures who mentor and pass down this set of ideas, institutions even that either influence other institutions or have kind of a knock-on effect. And so I think while that's largely outside the scope of the book, I do think I sort of end with a brief sketch of what that kind of looks like. I think that there's more work to be done on that. There's some wonderful books out there about it, but I do think that you can see in the rhetoric of many people on the right today that direct through line. And in some ways today is we're seeing the achievement of what a lot of people in the 1950s, in the Red Scare, could only dream of: the dismantlement of large parts of the modern federal government, and the rooting out of supposed left-wing radicals. That was the dream, and now it's being achieved.
Yeah, and then you kind of mentioned the dismantling of the government agencies, and I think that kind of leads to what I was going to get into with Doge. I know mostly the argument for Doge is not necessarily conspiratorial in the anti-Semitic or anti-Black sense, although there is certainly an element of like how they talk about civil rights programs. But when it comes to this fear of this so-called deep state, this idea that there is a group of people in control of the government and it must be dismantled, it seems to me that there is an element of seeing the government's actions as inherently illegitimate. And then when people protest against that view of illegitimacy, it reinforces the narrative, similar to how McCarthyites who lost saw their loss as a means to justify their previous belief. And to me, what can be done to kind of pull people out of that perspective? Because once people get locked in this circular reasoning, it almost takes on a cultish narrative that is extremely dangerous.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think describing the reality rather than playing to the conspiracy theory is core to that. Good information is always the most important tool. Now, these days, I think that that's harder to do than ever. The mainstream media is not nearly as powerful as it used to be, while there's a lot of, let's say, alternative forms of media that are very partisan, that are spinning a very different story. And, to talk about Doge, I mean, I think that's one great example where, depending on how it's explained and how even how people in the government talk about it, sometimes they talk about it as, look, this is just about government efficiency. And we really just need to go in and clean out the waste, which is hard not to agree with, right? Of course, if, we want our tax dollars spent well. Now, other people talk about it, or they look at it as, in much more crusading terms or nefarious terms.
Mhm.
That Doge is fundamentally about dismantling this evil federal structure, right, and getting rid of woke policies that have terminally infected the federal government, whatever. I mean, but depending on who you are, you may hear one side or the other, or one version of the other. And I think that's also where you sort of wonder. I mean, I think for the people doing it, it's probably a little bit of both.
Mhm.
I don't think everybody involved in it believes in a conspiracy theory, but I think that when you look at Elon Musk, for example, and the way he talks about what his job is, sometimes he says one thing, sometimes he says it's the other. I think he probably believes that he's doing both.
And what I've been kind of mulling over while trying to figure out how to go about like talking about this issue with people, because I do engage a little bit in political canvassing and kind of that kind of operation, is one, how do you reach people who are not really sure where they're supposed to get their information? And you mentioned uh the mainstream media. And one of the things I've written about and raised concerns about is, while yes, there is a partisan media, and I'm running a show called The Progressive American, there is an element of what I do that is in this commentary sphere. But really good commentary and really good public media, or even media like this, does depend on that mainstream media. And private equity firms like Alden Global Capital have really got a lot of local newspapers and media environments. And so I guess the question I have is, to what extent do these cuts reinforce moral panics and make it easier for them to spread?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And look, while I think there's a huge crisis for local media, especially when it comes to the coverage of local issues, there's really no replacement for good locally reported, locally owned media, and that's largely disappearing. On the other hand, there are lots of ways to get the news, especially national news, a lot more than there used to be. And in some ways, that's a good thing. People have access to lots of different angles and lots of different takes, and that, in an ideal world, means that you'll have better informed readers or news consumers. But in reality, it takes a lot more work on the part of news consumers. You have to be willing to go out and find those sources. And whereas in the past, you only had a few TV channels to choose from, you only had a couple of newspapers to choose from, and they were all largely cut from the same cloth. And today there's a lot more opportunity and a lot broader sort of buffet of options, but you really have to look to find them and be willing to consume different sources. Because if you just kind of follow the old model and you say, okay, well, I'm just going to follow Fox or MSNBC, then you're really only going to get a certain amount of news, and a certain angle and a certain perspective. And whereas that might have worked in the past, today I just think you have to be much more active in searching to find some approximation of the truth.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I keep saying it to everybody I, like, interact with on this question is, "Don't watch the news, read it." Unless, of course, it's my show, then it's fine.
Watching's
No.
okay.
Yeah,
Watching, listening, reading,
yeah.
everything. Whatever, I try to be as uh, broad in my news consumption as possible, uh, because I try to be try to be critical in my points of view, try to see everything with a grain of salt, and hopefully come to my own conclusion. I think the worst thing that can happen is that people just sort of let commentators tell them what to think.
Yeah, and this is where, like, when I say, like, don't watch the news, read it. I emphasize this point because it takes a lot of time to fully grasp what's being discussed, what's being expressed. And the other thing is with like online news, especially when it's in digital format and you read it, there's a lot of links that people can go and check the source material that is being provided by the people that
Yeah,
are doing that writing. And I think that's really important. And
absolutely.
this kind of unfortunate perspective that people keep bringing up is don't trust the media, don't trust the media always lies. And I do think that kind of helps people like Donald Trump and other reactionary forces and really I wouldn't want to say debaucherous, irresponsible commentators
Yeah,
being able to spread their propaganda both on the left and the right. But to the other side of this, my concern is that we have a lot of people who seem to still think McCarthy was right, that
yeah.
uh, these fears of communist infiltration, this fear of a Marxism being thrown around irrespective of whether or not they know what that means, still has the light of day. And I'm wondering, where did that come from? Like, how did that maintain itself after seeing so many people lose their well-being, lose their freedom, their jobs, and really their lives?
Well, look, I think it comes down to, two really competing ideas about what America is about or what it should be. And they're they don't have to be diametrically opposed, but for certain people they are. On the one hand, we are a country of uh, a Christian country, a self-reliant country. We ourselves are self-reliant frontiersmen, going back to these sort of myths about the founding of America and the settling of America by, or the takeover of America by white settlers. And that's for a lot of people next to the Bible as their guiding light. And then there's a whole other point of view that is, America is never perfect. America is building on itself, and that America is fundamentally a place of diversity and pluralism. And you need a strong government to both check the power of capitalism, and to ameliorate some of its impacts, but also to be there to settle conflicts between different groups of people. And over ever since that second side emerged as a pretty powerful defining force in the 1930s, there's been a belief on the right that it is fundamentally un-American, right? Because it so violates their view of what America's ideal, what it's supposed to be. And I think for a lot of people, it's they take it realistically, but for a number of people, they take it to the extreme and say, people on the left are evil. People on the left are un-American. Not just they have a different idea about America than I do, but they are evil. They're doing something evil to America, and that becomes a very useful tool in a lot of ways. It becomes very easy to then say, well, anyone who pushes for civil rights, if I'm a Southern segregationist, well, that's not an idea that I grew up with. That's not an idea that I consider at all in sync with my view of America. Therefore, it is un-American, right? And it's very powerful way to demonize ideas that sort of tilt against the right's conception of America. So I think that's it's kind of why it's always stuck around, right? It's just a very easy, and you see it today in the way that President Trump talks about the left. right? It's never just liberals. It's never the Democratic Party. It's always, the radical Democrats. No matter how far to the right, how conservative a Democrat is, he's going to call them a radical Democrat. Um, and because it's a very useful way to say those people are not American, right? They're not fundamentally. There's something un-American about them, and I think this will probably be with us for a long time, certainly longer than any of the President Trump or JD Vance or anybody is in office. I mean, we're always going to have this conflict.
Yeah, once the genie's out of the bottle, it's kinda hard to put it back in.
It is. It is.
And I look at this and it's especially disheartening because 'cause I'm 26. I've pretty much spent most of my political career and even my writing career, and even just, like, the podcasting career with the consequences of one man's decision, and I
Mm.
think that's what makes, the Trumpist movement a little more distinct from the Red Scare, is
Mhm.
that there seems to be this cult of personality
Yeah.
around one man, a man who doesn't really embody a lot of the so-called values that they hold on to, especially when it comes to Christianity. But I do think that we also have to be careful because a lot of voters in the 2024 election and really in 2020 as well were mostly pocketbook voters. A lot of Americans
Yeah.
are unfortunately heavily focused on their pocketbooks in the short term and they don't see the long term picture. But to some extent, I also think that plays a role in complicity. And I was wondering, what role did the complicity of many Americans contribute to how the Red Scare developed, how it went on for so long, and how destructive it was?
Well, I think one through line that you could draw is that for most Americans, politics is uh, a secondary or tertiary consideration, and it enters into the focus of their thinking only when it directly affects something that's right there in front of them. Not all Americans. Some people are very concerned about politics on a regular basis, but for most people, it's and finances and personal economics, as you say, pocketbook. That's the most common way, right? If it suddenly seems like the economy is going down, they people blame the president. It's often this very reductive story, as if the president were responsible for inflation or job cuts, and rarely is that really the case. But so I think that's certainly an issue now. I think that's, as you said, a reason why Trump was so successful in his races. But it was also in a different way what I think you'd say about the Red Scare, and that a lot of people didn't think a lot about the Red Scare. It was not, if you were not a progressive or a hardcore conservative, it was something that was happening, but it happened to other people. And you were aware of it, maybe, but not really caring. And what came through to you was maybe you believed that there really was a threat out there and you thought that it was justified to go after communists wherever they were, or the fear came through to you and you got the message that for the time being at least it's best just to keep your head down and maybe not speak out, maybe not support people who might oppose the Red Scare. And you know so and that's why someone like McCarthy was able to rule through terror for so long, because I think it's a combination of people who actively supported him and people who were afraid of him and then people who just didn't care. And that's unfortunately a pretty clear through line throughout American history. And I think it's one thing that defines our political landscape today.
Yeah, apathy is one of the most dangerous political belief systems in American history, if I'm being completely honest.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an irony of American success. I mean, we've been so successful at creating a stable country for so relatively stable for so long, and a pretty efficient, pretty just contrary to what people think, we have a pretty efficient government and government system, one that stays out of people's lives for the most part, and certainly compared to other countries and other eras. But because of that, we've created a space where people can completely ignore politics and they don't have to think about these things. And they don't even have to think about the fact that they don't have to think about it. And
Mhm.
that's great until it's terrible, because then you don't have, in a crisis, you don't have an informed, engaged electorate, and that can be dangerous in all sorts of ways.
And to kind of hit on that note, you talked about how there is this attitude of like if you weren't directly affected by it, it was easier to ignore. And I think that kind of plays a role in the backlash right now that the Trump administration is putting forward towards the pro-Palestinian protests. Mahmoud
Mhm.
Khalil is a perfect example of that. You can argue whether or not his flyers were acceptable. I would argue that if assuming he was the one who was giving those out, those were definitely less than ideal, to put it very, very lightly.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he's not, as far as I'm aware, has not been charged with any crime. And the ability to otherize people because he's not a citizen, but instead has a green card, kind of plays on that role
Yeah.
of otherizing, removing people who are vulnerable, seeing them as not part of the system, and that they're not entitled to human dignity and human rights. Do you see a line between how the protest movements that occurred on campuses during the Red Scare were treated, and do you see a line to the Palestinian protests today?
Yeah, truth be told, there really weren't protests during the Red Scare. I mean, one of the things I think is really noteworthy about that period versus today is the lack of a protest movement.
Mm,
Uh, you know, we there was in the 1930s there was a pretty solid, pretty strong through line or strain of street activism. A lot of it based around labor rights, but also marches in favor of civil rights and women's rights and peace and what have you. Uh, After World War II, that just really wasn't part of the conversation, and partly it was just because most Americans just wanted to get on with their lives. Partly it was because you know, people were afraid, but it also set the stage for the 1960s, where you have a new generation of people, the baby boomers, coming along and looking at how their parents had responded to a period of cultural and political oppression, uh, and coming away with a very critical perspective. You know, they looked at their parents and said, "What do you mean you didn't stand up to McCarthy? What do you mean you weren't out in the streets? What is wrong with you?" And it was part of the critique posed by the new left, which was, the reason why we're here, why we're people are dying for civil rights, why we're involved in Vietnam, is because our parents' generation was complicit in that, and so we're not going to be complicit. We're going to stand up, and I think that setting aside the details of the excesses or mistakes of the 60s era, I think one of the great things to come out of it is an abiding commitment, not just on the left, but across America, to speak out and to express oneself. And so today, I think we see a pretty healthy expression of political dissent on campuses, and very much like the 60s, but not at all like the 50s, late 40s and 50s. And that's a good thing.
yeah, and I think the thing that a lot of Americans are, unfortunately, and you mentioned this with the apathy side of things, a lot of Americans are unfortunately under the impression that politics is an inherently dirty thing. And
Mhm.
that to me is a dangerous idea for two reasons. The first being, if you think something's dirty, you're going to avoid it. So you're never going to actually try and learn about it. And if you're never going to learn about it, you're never going to have your voices heard. So it reinforces the first point. And one of the things I really hope that interviews like this and really discussions in general about this historical period uh, point out is that there needs to be more political action. People need to learn more. They need to be able to inform themselves to really truly consent to their government. But as leading into my last question, if there was one core warning, one core point about the Red Scare that you would want Americans to remember, what would that be?
I mean, it would be, I think, exactly what we're talking about. That the Look, my book explains why the Red Scare happened the way it did, why it happened when it did. It puts it in history. But one of the warnings that I try to bake into that is that just because it happened at a particular time in a particular way, doesn't mean that it won't happen again in some other form. I mean, we may not call it a Red Scare, but this idea of political hysteria justifying political repression is something that can happen again and again. in different forms, maybe different enough where people don't even think about the historical precedent. And yet, the lessons of the historical precedent are absolutely vital for maintaining a strong dissent. And I say that not in a partisan way. This is true wherever it comes from, left, right, wherever. I think today, of course, it's primarily coming from the right, but we as a country always need to be able to balance our concerns for security, our concerns for ourselves, with an absolute commitment to civil liberties and wherever those are at issue, regardless of whose civil liberties they are, regardless of how distant they might be from our own lives. We have to recognize the possibility of continued repression and periods of repression. And so, the Red Scare to me then is a bright warning for anyone who wants
Oh, did he cut off?
to say, thank God we've moved
Oh,
beyond
I'm
that.
sorry, you cut off a little bit, like, in the middle of what you were saying. If you could repeat a little bit of what you were trying to
No
say.
problem. Yeah. No, I think just to reiterate that, I think that people need to remember that just because the Red Scare happened and it happened for particular reasons doesn't mean something like it can't happen again, and that we always need to be on guard to defend our civil liberties and those of other people's.
Yeah, exactly, and I think the thing that people need to remember is that they are not immune from propaganda. But I wanna thank you again for joining me. This has been a wonderful interview. The book is The Red Scare. The author is Clay Risen. You can find it anywhere on your bookstores, Amazon, thrift books, and a couple of other places as well, correct?
Absolutely. Wherever books are sold.
Wonderful. Thanks again, and have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thanks a lot, Connor.